and welcome to the National Leprechaun Museum's Talking Series. It's Mark again, and I'm joined today by Tom.
Hey, Tom. Hi, how are you? Good to see you.
Tom, the Talking Series is a chance to focus in on different aspects of Irish mythology without actually telling stories.
Okay.
To look at things that inform the stories, and today we're talking hedgerows.
Hedgerows, yeah.
A really hot topic at the moment.
Hot topic. It is, and that's surprising, I guess, but it's certainly come to the fore over the past week. Been some news articles on it.
Yeah.
A lot of comments about people maintaining it and what the county councils are doing.
Yeah.
And when we can cut hedgerows, when we can't cut hedgerows. It's a hot button for a lot of people now.
Yeah.
I suppose because it's very visible. You can see someone cutting a hedgerow as you're driving by in your car. They're pretty visible, pretty photographable, and you can see a lot of people. What surprises me, there's a lot of before and after photographs. So maybe it's people getting out of the car before the guy gets to cut that part of the hedge and then do the picture afterwards.
But it doesn't seem like something like, when people in the past in Ireland have been up in arms over the cutting down of trees.
Yes.
And that just seems like a much bigger deal. But yeah, people are getting really worked up over what are, to some people, just essentially hedges.
There are, I would say, just fewer and fewer touch points for people with nature.
Yeah.
And the hedgerows, that kind of, that seemingly unkempt feel to it, that kind of naturalistic feel to it, it's a touch point for people.
Yeah.
And you can imagine things happening. And often, when you go down the country, maybe you're on a small road and there's a green line down the middle of the road where the grass is growing and the trees have met up in the middle, and you're in a double hedgerow and it looks like a green tunnel.
Yeah. And
it kind of takes you away. It softens your whole vision. I guess what I'd say is we're not meant to live in cubes, whether metal car cubes or concrete cubes where we work, and we're meant to be in a more natural environment that's natural to us to be in those kind of environments. So I think it does kind of touch people when they see it disappearing in front of their eyes.
But it is as well a way of kind of nature dividing up the land, or people dividing up the land, and I suppose in a more aesthetic and environmental way as well. They serve a purpose.
They do. Well, it's a manufactured landscape, and it's made for land division, for retaining cattle in, and I suppose most of the hedgerows in Ireland are coming in around the 17th, 18th century as they begin to enclose lands, and there was prescribed things for it. You had to build a ditch,
right,
and you had to set it with quick sets. So quick sets would be things like hawthorns that would grow quickly.
Yeah.
But it's one of the beauties of the Irish idiom is that we have the hurler on the ditch. You know, and every other country the ditch is in the ground. In Ireland, it's up off the ground.
Yeah.
So that's a funny point, but it's uniquely Irish. But the hedgerows are growing out of that. I suppose we should define what a hedgerow is.
Go for it.
So, it's a collection of plants which are less than 4 meters deep.
Right.
Okay, and less on average than 5 meters high. The minimum requirement, I think, at the time was about 4 feet deep, 6 foot high. That was when they were building the boundaries, saying this is what it has to be. So, but in reality, what we've got then is it's not trees, it's not woodland. It's a collection of smaller shrubs and maybe some trees thrown in, but they tend to be punctuated. The trees tend to be punctuated, and the length of it on a field, it has to be at least a quarter of the field long for it to qualify as a hedgerow. So that's it. 4 meters deep max, 5 meters high max, and at least a quarter of the field length. And I would say at least 4 feet deep, because I think below that you're into hedging rather than hedgerows.
Right. Who's gone around measuring these things?
Well, there is actually people who've done it, and there's a number of, the Heritage Council have done stuff. So you see a lot of people at the Woodland Trust have done stuff.
Yeah.
They've counted the number of species in it, and you can age the hedgerow by the number of species in it. So if you go on linear, you can go this number of species in it, because it takes time for these to establish. Yeah. So the greater the degree of varietals and plant types in it, then they can date the trees. But to support, then you've got, because it's such a big mix of plants, you've got all different kinds of nature being supported in that. So I think 55 of our 110 birds will live in a hedgerow. Yeah. So
wow.
So it's quite a bit. We haven't got forests anymore. In reality, there aren't huge tracts. Not when Edmund Spenser came here to write about the wild Irish in Elizabethan times and said it was an unruly forest with unruly people in it. That's what we had, and now we're on the margins now. And I think the approach we're taking to hedgerows is the same kind of approach that the county council have took to rivers, where they had this riparian area where you'd get flooding, and then there'd be trees along, or small trees grown, or bushes along the side of the river, and the council come along and make a culvert which is concreted in order to control it. And we miss the nature, we miss the floodplains, we miss the absorbency, and this is what happened with hedgerows, because hedgerows provide a huge function in terms of drainage, restricting water directly flowing off surfaces. So
and restricting the spread of diseases as well.
I would imagine so. The other thing, I suppose, in history, so we can say that we know there were hedgerows back in Bronze Age times.
Yeah.
Probably not as extensive as we have now. And the numbers I think that are being talked about are about 800,000 kilometres of hedgerows in fields and on roadsides, and about 300,000 kilometres on roadsides. So nearly enough, I think, to get you to the moon. I think that would be...
So it's not going to be a book you're going to do where you walk Ireland's hedgerows?
I think that... Yeah, so what probably is, if you want to see the back of me.
But it is amazing, like, kind of just the variety, and yet once they're established, they're fairly robust. You know, in terms of an environment, like, kind of they protect themselves pretty well.
Yes, and they provide shelter for animals.
Yeah.
Both the domesticated animals, you know, the dairy farms and all that, and also the wildlife.
Yeah.
And they'd be natural reservoirs, bioreservoirs, because they'll contain a whole lot of biodiversity within them. So there's a whole lot of stuff. So environmental stuff, like physical environmental stuff, like rainfall, wind, and then you've got all this biodiversity stuff going on as well. So, and you would say that some of those plants, you know, they're all largely native plants. We do see the fuchsias and stuff like that, and some others, but largely, and you know, things like the white thorn, like the elder, they're pretty visible at certain times of the year.
Yeah.
And they're pretty suitable for those kind, because the whitethorn does like to be on the edges of forests. It's where it thrives best.
And they're fairly fast grown as well, because I mean, the hedgerows wouldn't be something you imagine people to farm, but yet they do produce, like we mentioned the blackthorn, in terms of like kind of like cutting them for making shillelaghs and the likes. So you can farm a hedgerow within reason.
I think there's, you know, when you're in these environments, I would say subsistence environments.
Yeah.
You're looking to make use of it. So you have your blackthorn shillelagh. You've also got your sloes.
Yeah.
For your sloe gin. You probably have other medicinal qualities coming out of that.
Yeah.
You know, hawthorn has medicinal quality. The flowers have medicinal qualities. Meadowsweet, fairly common on the edge of the hedgerows that used to flavour beer.
Yeah.
It's also an astringent. It's, I think, one of the plants that led to the discovery of aspirin.
Wow.
Okay. So,
in terms of foraging, then it's like a treasure trove of.
You're going to use that.
You could live off
whatever's available, and you know, you've got blackberries growing there, brambles, all of that. So they're all available at certain times of the year. The other comment on for food would be that old phrase, the Long Acre.
Yeah. Where
people put their animals onto the roads to graze along the margins, and especially the drovers, because in the past, you know, you'll pass a cattle truck now, but in the past, the cattle were walked to a market, or walked to wherever they were got their destination. So they would be eating and grazing as they went along.
Wasn't that almost the purpose of roads, like for walking your cattle to market, the
Bohar, and that's a cow and a cross, is the dimension of a road in Ireland. So just showing you how important the cattle industry. And we went up to Rathcrohan. And the reason that the Queen Maeve's centre of power is there, it's a limestone plain. The grass is good, it rains a lot, and the cows tend to do well. So happy out.
When you mentioned Queen Maeve there as well, like, do we see an importance of the hedgerows or elements of the hedgerows in regards to our storytelling and our folklore and mythology?
So yes, so if we went back, like as far back as we go, would be into the kind of Oisin's poems.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at those now, there's all contention about what dates they're written on, but you can certainly say it's 1,000 years plus. And I think that the phrase I like is, the quatrain I like is, when Fionn and the Fianna lived, they loved the hills, not hermit cells. Blackbird speech is what they loved, not the sound unlovely of your bells. And this is an address from Usheen to St. Patrick.
Yeah.
Going, I want to be in nature.
Yeah.
I want nature around me.
I can understand the appeal of that.
And that's the Blackbird of Derry Carn. That's
Yeah.
that poem. But that also repeats then in Ode to a Nightingale, Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. And he's talking about, the grass, the thicket, the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn and pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. So, but we don't get that poetic feeling, this Shirin Roku forest bathing.
Yeah.
And if you want to access nature, the hedgerow is the first place you're going to find it.
Yeah.
And
it's accessible as well.
Listen, those stories about the guy walking down the road and hearing the tapping of a tiny hammer.
Yeah.
And he looks through the hedgerow because it's liminal. It separates the road from the other.
Yeah, it's that border between, because it's never obvious. It's never in plain sight. You don't happen across something and it's in your face straight away. There's these kind of signaling kind of factors to the stories that you have to work to get to the thing that you want.
You do, and it's not always visible. What those treasures or that story is not always visible. It just happened at that very moment. I happened to be in that place, and I just turned to look, and I just happened to see. So it's like the amazing confluence of events,
Yeah.
So the introduction of the hedgerows in the 18th century also gave rise to one of the famous things of Ireland, which is the hedge schools.
Yeah.
And whether they were actually at hedges or in barns or elsewhere, a lot of them did take place behind hedges or near hedges with a bit of shelter afforded them. And it's one of the I suppose one of the things that stood to Irish people quite a lot is their love of education.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, we needed to get educated because we would be denied it. The penal laws denied us an education, and it became something that we needed to get.
I think it's a great thing with Irish people that if you want them to do something, you can tell them they can't. And I mean, they will find a way to produce that thing or to do that thing on their own terms in secret more often than not.
So the hedge schools were running up to the 19th century, well into the late in the 19th century. I think the Catholic Church had a role in getting people from unregulated schools into regulated schools, and the unruly hedgerow is a kind of argument between nature and organisation, or a different kind of organisation, because the forests have their own rules.
Absolutely.
And I suppose the hedgerows are kind of the spider's web out, reaching from one reservoir to another.
Yeah.
And they are, I suppose you'd say, look, they are runways or pathways for nature along those corridors. And you'll often see now, in particularly in the UK, people building tunnels in fences to let hedgehogs through. Yeah. And a hedgerow has all that built in. They're built for nature.
Well, we learn from nature. We look at what works in nature and we try to replicate that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I can see why people would be doing that. But it's nice to see it kind of that it's being appreciated. That we're now inviting nature kind of into our land and into our homes again.
Yeah. The bit about people removing hedgerows now, and it's because this is the conversation, and this is not the reason. This is the reason we began this conversation last week.
Yeah.
Was the removal of hedgerows, and we know that it's done for purposes of traffic safety. But
and I get that.
Give a man a sharp blade, and he's going to start cutting stuff, and he'll keep on doing it until someone tells him to stop.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, it's also done because a lot of farmers now are trying to reduce their costs, and a larger field has lower costs.
Yeah.
And it's not just gaining the extra land, it's a means of, it just takes one gate to open. You have to get a tractor once, and it becomes more efficient for them to have larger fields. And this happened in the UK with the introduction of CAP, big hedgerow removal across the UK.
Yeah.
so it's just a factor of that's where the money is. That's what people are going to do. It may even be marginal, the amount of money they're making, but it's just something to do, and it seems like the right thing. Very hard for an individual sitting in Dublin City to argue with the farmer about removing a hedgerow. So I just think that the systems we put in place aren't fit for purpose right now.
No, I think the focus is slightly off. But I mean, when you look in terms of the scale of it, when you're saying, like, what was it? It was 4 feet originally, but now it's 4 meters is the depth.
4 meters is the maximum it should be. Otherwise, you're moving into woodland.
Yeah. But if you even go 4 meters and you're saying 800,000 kilometers, that is a big chunk of land that if we were to put it all together, it's.
Yes, absolutely. If you box it all into one place, but they're not always accessible. They're running by water courses, so and also I think they perform. The functions that these things. Nature's very resilient up to a point. Until it's not. And the danger is that you move beyond that 50% plus one, where it's no longer resilient. And one of the arguments you'd have then is we're only custodians of this place for a period of time, shepherding it through, where it's a stewardship issue.
Yeah.
So we've got to say, are we going to leave it better or worse for the next people that come along? And so those arguments, and yes, it may be very nice to have some money coming in by virtue of having a larger estate or an easier to farm piece of land, but what's left then afterwards is slightly less.
There's an immediacy to how kind of people think. They think about kind of very, relatively speaking, short term in terms of I need to put food on the table next week, next month, next year. They're not thinking of the long term effects that it'll have if they remove the hedgerows.
Yeah, listen, if it comes down to the point of saying about putting food on the table, I think it's about putting more likely to be putting an Xbox in the bedroom. So and there are things that people were coded up to want, were advertised at to want, and it's just a process. And if there's anybody there who's if we have a major problem with people not being able to put food on the table and woodland being or hedgerows being the issue, I think we have a serious question to ask of ourselves if that's the equation.
Well, we've seen it happen before, like kind of way. Like if you make the thing that you want to preserve kind of sexy and you make it topical, then people very quickly can buy into it. So you'd almost want to be looking at advertising on behalf of the hedgerows. And we've seen it work with bees. Suddenly bees are like, I mean, I grew up like being terrified of bees. They were everywhere. I was worried about getting stung by the things, but now people are walking around with bee tattoos, bee prints on their bags, floral print dresses with bees, and bees are protected because they're so important. And I'd probably put hedgerows in a par with that.
Yes, I think one of the okay. So, who benefits from the wood from seeing a nice hedgerow? When I'm driving along in the comfort of my car, I'm looking at the window. God, that's a lovely hedgerow. Look at the big white flowers on that. Isn't that lovely? And there's birds. And the people doing the work behind the scenes, the farmers, the custodians of the land, the county councils, are not the ones who are benefiting from that. So
no, that's fair.
It's slightly. I hear you. They're really nice. They're really important. It's a question of building some value that's tangible for people who are looking after the landscape.
Yeah, and communicating that value out to people,
and making it real for them. And I think there's certainly work underway with Europe, but that's a big piece of machinery to get moving. And these are manufactured landscapes. When people think of the fields of Ireland, the 40 shades of green, the fields of Ireland, the hedgerows, that's a concept that people have in their heads about how things are. It's a cultural landscape. And I think if we lost that, we'd all be diminished.
Yeah, we absolutely would. Like, I mean, they're amazing to explore as well. The hedgerows, like, kind of, it kind of just brings you kind of alive. I love going along a hedgerow and seeing the old stone wall that it's overgrown. The evidence of something else in there that it's kind of reclaimed the space from.
There's always something to be found.
Yeah,
we were at the Fest conference in Belgium last 2 years ago now.
Yourself and Paddy.
Yeah, and we were stopped at a small chapel, and we looked in the hedgerow, and there were all these wild strawberries growing. So we're picking wild strawberries in because there's always something to be found.
Yeah,
and that's the joy of it.
Unfortunately, too many empty crisp packets. You know what I mean? The rubbish kind of that inevitably finds its way into hedgerows around Ireland.
Yes, and that's a symptom of what we're in now in this consumer society where we're, and it's driven by telling us that we're in charge, that our needs and our desires are the most important things.
Yeah.
And all they're doing is creating within an anxiety within us that needs to be filled with stuff. And this is just the spoils of, if you've ever been to one of those ancient sites where there's a midden, we were on Omey Island there during the summer, and along the side there was an old settlement.
Yeah.
And in the banks where it had been eroded by the wind and wave, there's just stacks and stacks of shells, where these people had obviously sat and cooked it and then thrown the shells.
Yeah.
And there it was, maybe 8 foot high, of a wall of shells.
Wow. And
that was what they discarded. And now I wonder in the future people come along and find Club orange tins or a bottle of White Claw or something else.
There's amazing things that you can find, and when you're talking about kind of like the beach and the shells, I'm thinking about how you're not allowed to remove stones from certain beaches because they're there to serve a purpose and that, But then when you find, and for me it's like finding treasure, a nice piece of driftwood, or a nice piece of glass that's been kind of eroded down and the edges have been softened. What are the things you'd find like in a hedgerow? I know the stories of people doing, with pot stills, and they have them here on the hedgerows, so that if they're discovered, you could argue who they belong to.
Fine, okay.
What's the type of thing? What would you love to find while exploring?
No, wild strawberries. We were up in Blessed Reservoir, found some sloes.
Yeah.
Gathered them over the winter. Made some sloe gin.
Nice.
Wild strawberries. Then there are all kinds of things. So you have the meadowsweet growing there.
Yeah.
You've got vetches growing there. So they're like it's essentially a pea type thing, and if you cook it down, it tastes like peas. It's and why wouldn't you? So there's all you brought the shillelagh in with you today. So there are all these things there to be done, and even if you don't see, you'll hear a bird.
Yeah.
You may or may not see an animal, but you'll see the spoor of the animal, the trail it left as it goes in and out, and then you begin to imagine what would that have been. And then there's always that thing of a bit of sheep's wool stuck on a bramble, and you're going, where's the sheep? I can't see any.
Yeah.
So they become places of imagination, because you can imprint whatever you think onto it.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up obviously in Tala and at the foot of the Dublin Mountains, and the walk up to the Hellfire Club and up by Carty's Castle there, the house that used to be owned by the Loftus family.
Yeah.
On your way up, and I remember finding an old wooden police truncheon in a hedge.
This is the possibility is that anything could be found there.
Yeah.
Left there, discarded, hidden, dropped.
It's that idea of like ill-gotten gains, the spoils of some kind of criminal act being hidden in there. And I know when we've seen like kind of the paintings stolen from Russborough House, a lot of them were buried and very kind of roughly just thrust into the landscape.
Yes.
And then an awful lot of them were uncovered, but then a lot of them haven't been. But this idea of these thieves in the night, like storing their ill-gotten gains in the hedgerows is amazing.
It's a bit like, it reminds me of the pike in the thatch,
Yeah.
My mother had a phrase, God rest her, a rag in every bush. For myself and my brother used to go to parties quite a bit when we were younger.
I can imagine.
And you might be going at it a bit hard.
Yeah.
So she'd say a rag in every bush, that you kept going the road until there was nothing left of you.
We see in the stories the idea of like these men, it's always men arriving home and they've been trapped in a fairy field, and they've turned the coat inside out and they're disheveled. And when you remove the magical element from those stories, it is a guy coming home from a late night out, and he's, as you say, hitting it quite hard and arriving back in such a state that his only excuse he can give is by blaming things on otherworldly happenings.
I just reminded there of something else, which is this must be one of the few places left in Europe that has that extensive network of hedgerows.
Yeah.
And the only place I can compare it to is the Bocage in Normandy, which is
never been.
So, and when you go there, the roads are set lower and the hedges are high,
right?
And it has that kind of, you don't know where you are.
Yeah.
You're having to continually look for, as you go around, to look for waypoints on it, because the hedges are high, so you get lost in the hedges. Yeah. But even that place that features in Game of Thrones, the dark hedges. It has. There's something about hedges that has this. I believe Westminster was built on an island of thorns. That the Cathedral of Westminster is located on a specific, what I suppose we'd refer to as a nemed, or a nematon, a sacred grove. So this all fits in with those places of imagination.
Yeah, and it's the folklore around those spaces and
the mythology built around that, and the plants that you will find common or uncommonly in hedgerows.
Yeah,
that's where you're going to find the ungrazed elements of those special plants that were sacred and medicinal.
Yeah.
So I think they fulfill a huge amount of things, environmentally, socially, imaginatively.
Yeah.
They do a whole lot of things for us, and that's the importance of hedgerows.
I mean, when you're walking out and you see them and you can enjoy them, and when I kind of really think about it, I remember everything that they've given me, like kind of as a kid, whether that's eating the blackberries at the edge of the field where my father was refereeing football matches.
Yes.
I had no interest in football, but we'd go around the hedgerows picking blackberries.
Yeah.
Up till a certain date, because we knew not to go near them after a certain point because of the puka. But you don't think about them on the large scale until you sit down and have a conversation. Like the conversation we started having a week ago, which has led us to where we are now. But we've scratched the surface with it.
Scratched the surface.
Yeah. Well, Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm sorry for shooting off.
But that's the whole idea, and that's the thing I love about the talking videos. It's a chance to talk about something that may feature briefly in a story, but has its own importance and its own weight. And it's nice to get the time to talk about it.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you again very soon for another one of our talking series. Goodbye.